What's going on, everybody? We are still looking at games from the Olympiad, and I will be doing so for probably the next couple of days. This game is from the Ukraine-Serbia match with the white pieces of Vasily Ivanchuk and with the black pieces Serbian Grandmaster Alexei Sarana. Game started off d4, knight f6, c4, e6. So Nimzo Indian, bishop b4, e3, and now we're in the Rubinstein variation of the Nimzo Indian defense. Nothing new here. Castles, bishop d3, and now c5 from Ivanchuk. Again, I just want to remind everybody, please hit that like button, check the links below, and support the channel if you can, if you appreciate the content. Thank you. Let's keep going. So knight ge2, right, keeps the pawn structure intact. Typically, we see in the Nimzo Indian where black takes on c3, then white has to take with the pawn, and then you have this battle whereby white has space advantage but compromised pawn structure. So here in this variation with the knight coming to e2, backing up the knight on c3, now it takes away this idea that black has of doubling up the pawn structure. So black, at least for the time being, doesn't have this big incentive to capture with this bishop on c3. He'll basically just be giving up the bishop here for no reason. Game continues. C takes d4 from Ivanchuk. E takes d4, d5, and now c5 from Sarana. Anytime you see moves like this where the tension gets released in the position and white's kind of trying to bind up the position, if you're black, you really have to consider moves like e5 and b6. I'm not saying you can get away with it all the time, but you have to consider them, because these type of positions are the type of positions that will you can end up in a lot of hot water as black, because they're so, what happens is like a gradual squeeze, right? White takes a little bit of space, he gives up a tempi, right? Plays c5, it's like big deal, and then slowly but surely he like clamps down on the position. So it's kind of like, all right, what's white's idea here, right? As you can see, by playing a move like c5 here, he's established a 3-2 majority on the queen side. So he's already, putting a little, storing away a little points for, potential end game down the road. Another thing he's doing is causing this bishop to have further difficulty in developing, right? The white bishop on c8 will have a lot of trouble getting out if he's not careful. And this is another reason why a move like b6 here would be good. But we'll return to that later in our post-mortem analysis. So knight c6 happened. Right, Ivanchuk's putting pressure on the d pawn. Castles, and now Ivanchuk takes. Bishop takes c3. Knight takes c3, and this is like a gambit here. It's not like he just dropped the pawn. Ivanchuk plays knight takes d4, and white gets the pawn right back with bishop takes h7. Knight takes h7, and queen takes d4. And I've highlighted the rough plans for each side. You can see, again, I mentioned the 3-2 majority on the queen side from white earlier, and he's already kicked it off with the move c5. And notice if the pawn was on c4, at some time black could play d takes c4, and then it wouldn't be a majority on the queen side. So this is something that, as the game goes on, white has to always be mindful of the 3-2 majority. Another feature you'll notice in this position that I have highlighted is the bishop on c8. Notice that it's locked behind the white pawns. At this point, it's a bad bishop. Conversely, black's dark square bishop is in excellent shape. Has nice squares it can go to, like f4, for example. And it looks like a good piece. And the red arrows highlight black's general plan with his pawns, because what does black get out of all of this, right? Black gets the preponderance of pawns in the center, which is fantastic on paper. However, for pawns to be considered good, they have to be useful. They have to be mobile, right? For them to be considered an asset. If the pawns become stuck at any time, and this is old theory from Nimzovich and Max Erva, and the old chess players, if the pawns get stuck where they can't move, they just become liabilities and targets. Because what it is now the pawns just have to be defended as they're stuck, and the squares around the pawns are weak. So in this case, it's the dark squares around those light squares. And you can see that if black cannot move those pawns, that he's going to have tremendous trouble completing his development, namely because of that bishop on c8. All right, so that's black's basic plan, is to be able to advance those pawns in the center. And right now you can see with the knight on c3, queen on d4, he can't play e5 right now because he would just drop a pawn, so he has to orchestrate the move. So queen f6 was played, offering a trade of queens. Bishop e3, just continuing with development. Queen takes f6 could have been played, but this is good for black, right? Alleviates some of the danger in the position as far as attacking possibilities on the king side, and it reroutes a knight that was out of play and brings him right back into the center. So nobody worth their salt is gonna just trade queens there, unless they just want to give black easy equality. So bishop e3, and now Ivanchuk decides on this move a5, which is a critical move here. And the idea behind a5 is to play against white's queenside expansion. So white wants to play moves like b4, right? a4, b4, b5, and eventually create a pass pawn on the queen side. So a5 is like a prophylactic move against that. However, it has its drawbacks, as you can see. I have highlighted. The knight can jump into b5 and eventually land on d6. And you can see black has a light square bishop, so it's very hard to get rid of that knight once it gets to d6, unless you can trade it off for the other knight. But look where the black knight is right now. It's on h7 in a bad area. All right, so a5, although understandable, is definitely a double-edged move. Another idea, queen takes d4 here, right? Bishop takes d4, but again, look at the lock on the dark squares that white has. Okay, so again, still hard for black to get that e5 idea, and play can continue bishop d7. And again, I have highlighted white's plan from here. Play moves like f4. Again, once you know the ideas, then you can play to stop your opponent's ideas while implementing yours. So of course he wants to expand on the queen side. It's easy plan, right? He wants to expand on the queen side, make something out of that 3-2 majority. At the same time, he wants to hinder black as much as possible from liberating his pieces. So that's a possible variation. Another variation, if black didn't play a5, is just to play the move bishop d7. But then white can play b4 himself. So again, and then follow up by a4. So it might be a matter of taste, but it's very a5, as you know, is very committal. So queen d2 was played, and white's idea is quite simple. He wants to avoid the trade of queens, keep his options open, and keep his attacking possibilities on the table. So queen d2 is played, and the idea is just to replace the queen with the bishop, right? You don't want your high ranking queen just being a mere blockader, right? So you give that job to a lower ranking piece. So queen d2. And then bishop d7 is played. Another idea, instead of even queen d2 here, is just simply knight a4, exploiting the weakness left by a5 right away. And say, for example, bishop d7, knight b6, rook a d8, and that's another possibility. And white, you know, has a slight and annoying advantage in a lot of these lines. This line goes a little further, but I'll leave it right there. Rook ae1's a possibility, but it does allow the trade of queens here. And again, you can see some of black's ideas. And this is black's other idea, is to be able to attack on the king side. So again, going back to a5. So queen d2 was played by Serbian player Alexei Sarana. Bishop d7. And now bishop d4. Queen to f5. Of course, Ivanchuk, being a strong grandmaster, he knows what he has to do. So he wants to try to get this plan, these pawns rolling. f6, e5. All right. And how is he going to do that? Rook ae1. White's playing to stop, to hinder, hold back, all counterplay. f6, f4. So he can't do it. Not yet, anyway. So Ivanchuk plays the move rook f7. Again, he has to do something about this knight on h6. Right? Get it back into the game somehow. Maybe bring the knight to f8. And then maybe to g6, right, to help with this e5 move. And the thing is, too, is black has to do something about the d pawn, because the knight on c3 is always threatening to take that pawn if there is some type of advance. All right. So rook f7 was played by Ivanchuk. And after that, a4 was played by Sarana. This is a strong move here, because now the knight on c3 has another option to enter the position, and that's via b5 and then again d6. Before, he couldn't enter it with the bishop on d7 because the knight would just get snatched off. So Ivanchuk played rook f7, and then white played a4. So perhaps, let's see what would happen if black plays the move a4 instead of rook f7 himself. So if he plays a4, you can keep the white knight off b5. Then play may go rook e3, rook f7, rook h3. And again, now you can see why white wanted to keep the queens on the board, because he has this option of attacking on both sides of the board. He can switch from pushing on the queen side and then attacking on the king side. So knight f8, queen e2, and this is just a sample line right here, just to give you an idea of the rich possibilities in the position. Rook c8, rook h5, attacking the queen, queen g6, queen d1. Right, the pawn is attacked. a3. That's another downside of advancing the pawns really early sometimes, is that if you're not careful, they are susceptible. There's b4 that we talked about earlier, rook e7. And you can see the same ideas over and over. Black struggling to try to get these pawns mobile. Rook h3, queen f5, queen e2. And this is, again, just part of a sample line. And the idea here is, as highlighted, g4, driving the queen out of the way, followed by knight takes d5, because you can see the position of the rook on e7. It would be, hanging, and this would allow the tactic. But g4 first to knock the queen out of the way. All right, so the queen couldn't capture on d5. So then perhaps you could have the rook goes to e8 and the pawns advance. And as you can see, the play is going back and forth, right? On one side of the board to the other. King side, queen side, king side, queen side. Queen g6. And that's the end of that particular variation. So that's what it would look like, or could look like possibly, if black had played a4 himself and tried to shut white down on the queen side. But Ivanchuk played rook f7 with this other idea of getting the knight to f8 and possibly the g6. So a4, knight f8, and now h3. And again, you'll start to see this play on both sides of the board. So queen h7, knight b5. Now you might say to yourself, knight b5, can't black just play bishop takes b5 and get rid of the bad bishop? Yes, he can, but it's kind of being between a rock and a hard place now, because if he takes, now white will always have this threat of creating this passed pawn. Those pawns start becoming very dangerous. And in the game, Ivanchuk did not take. So this shows you how dangerous this idea was, because Ivanchuk was willing to allow this knight to get to the d6 square. And he played the move bishop c6, and basically turning his bishop into a glorified pawn. But it shows you how important this idea of moving these pawns are. And this was why I wanted to show you this game. This is a great game to illustrate the importance of having a mobile pawn center, not just a big pawn center. And this principle applies to all openings, and it's most visible when you have these big pawn centers. For instance, 4 pawns attacking the Alekhines defense, certain King's Indian defense attacks. When the pawns become stagnant, they just become big liabilities, and what happens is the position starts to collapse, because the pieces cannot defend and defend and defend forever. All right. So bishop c6 was played. Again, now the d5 pawn is stable. So now black hopes to be able to get this move in e5 at some point. All right. So let's look what would happen on b5. Bishop takes b5, excuse me. So bishop takes b5. Of course, a takes b5. And this is a sample line. This did not happen during the game. So let's say a4. And then again, preparing the push of the pawns. c6. And now you have this dangerous pass pawn. White could also play rook takes c6 here and push the pawn on the b file with the protection from the great bishop on d4. So that's another idea. For example, knight g6. Again, the idea trying to push the pawns, right? Trying to push the e pawn. So queen e3, rook e8, and there's that pawn starting to run away. Got to do something about it, right? So bishop c5 and king h7, rook c7. And again, this is just a simple line, but white is in control at this point. And this is just to give you an idea of why Ivanchuk didn't just snatch the bishop off. So instead, he played bishop c6, rook e3, rook to e7, queen e2. And notice Sarana is always careful in guarding the center. This is why the center is not just something you play for in the opening. This is something that you're always keeping your eye on during the game. So we're in move 22. They're still fighting in the center. It's not like one side is just giving up. And this is what a lot of beginning chess players do. They'll play in the center in the beginning, right, in the opening, and then in the middle game transitions, they forget all about the center. But here you can see the players are still actively fighting for the center. So queen e2, rook d8, b3, and now Sarana is preparing for this leap of the knight into d5, right? So he protects the pawn on a4 first with b3. Rook a8. So Ivanchuk is doing a little shuffling here because he really can't do too much. He figures he has his pieces in optimal positions. He can't do too much, so but play the waiting game. So things have not worked out for him at all. Knight d6, rook d7. The knight goes back to b5. All right. Another plan. This is a sample line. Rook g3. And the idea is simply just to threaten to take the f6 pawn. So let's say, for example, king h8, right? Natural move. Rook g4, with the idea of just simply playing the move g3. So let's say after b6, g3, and then just swinging the rook over. All right. So a lot of options here for black. For white. But instead, Sarana just came back with the knight, played b5, knight to b5. Queen h6 was played. And now queen g4. And what you're going to see now is kind of an implementation of the same kind of plan on the king side, but just in a different way. So rook e7, some more shuffling from Ivanchuk. Knight d6. Offering the trade of queens. Sarana says no. Queen h4, queen h7. Want to trade queens? Nope. Queen f2. Some more shuffling, back to shuffling. So basically Ivanchuk is saying, okay, I know I have a bad position, but how are you going to improve yours? Sarana says, I'm going to improve it by threatening to take on f6. So you can see the same kind of position I showed you in the variation is showing up. Rook g3, queen h6, rook g4. The difference here, though, is the queen is on f2, so the queen is able to support the rook on h4 instead of having the pawn on g3. b6 by Ivanchuk. What else is he going to do, right? He's trying to get some type of counterplay, so he's trying to undermine the knight. Rook h4, queen g6, f5. The rest of the game really doesn't need any comment. But knight takes f5, b takes c5, rook g4, and Ivanchuk gives up the queen. Queen takes g4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Bishop goes back, g5, and the rest of it is just Ivanchuk running on steam. Queen takes g5, knight e6, and then queen g6 attacking the knight and the rook on e8. And at this point, Ivanchuk had enough. And in 41 moves, Alexei Sarana had defeated Ukrainian Grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk. That was a great game. I really enjoyed that game a lot. I hope you enjoyed it too. Please like and subscribe. Go on the links below. You'll see books and DVDs related to the opening. I always post that down there, and also donation links. Before we go, I want to show you some things that maybe some recommendations that black could have done here, because it's always it's not a one-sided affair. Obviously, black went wrong at some point in the opening and wound up with a really treacherous position, or perhaps Ivanchuk forgot some of his own preparation and ended up in such a dubious position where he was absolutely steamrolled after the time control. All right, so I'm gonna go all the way back here to the opening. D5, C5, knight C6, and I believe that all of this is, of course, seen before, playable. This is all well known. Even queen F6. I just believe Sarana just played really good, but I think even superior to queen B6 might be a move like just B6 that I mentioned earlier. And I'll show you this sample line, right? So B6 here. So in the game, queen F6 was played, but B6, just confronting this idea of this queenside expansion right away. But now the only downside is that it seems, okay, you're helping with the majority, right? That you're playing on the side that white wants you to play on, because now there'll be a 2-1 majority. All right, but I think it's important not to get your counterplay stifled, and I think that is justified here. So after, say, B6, rook D1, B takes C5, say bishop D7. All right, first of all, the good points that I see is that black at least has some more scope for the light square bishop. There's hope for that bishop. If you notice, that bishop didn't get into the action the entire game. I mean, there was a chance where the bishop could have captured on B5, captured the knight, but then it would have just been basically going into a real bad position. Jumping out of the fire into the frying pan, so to speak. Right, you have similar idea: bishop C6, bishop E3, and then queen B8. And there's some kind of to me, this position seems a little bit freer for black. And that's after. So those are the main choices I would think is B6, between B6 and queen F6. This is like kind of what happened in the game. And this is another variant of what happened in the game. So queen F6 and bishop E3 took place in the game, but at this point, Ivanchuk played the move A5. So bishop D7, instead of making such a committal move again with A5, maybe allow this plan with B4 to take place. But it's still a tough game. Right? There's possibilities. Still a tough game for white. I'm sorry, for black. So I have to go back even further, because to be honest, I don't like this position, the position that develops at all for black. I know it's theory and all of that, but it seems like a difficult position to go into. So I think you have to go back a little further in the opening. Maybe after C5 here, and after knight C6, I think knight C6, right? This was in the game. Castle, a move that black can consider is E5. And play might go A3, bishop takes C3, B takes C3, and then B6. Say bishop B5, queen C7. And these are all sample lines, just to be clear. C takes B6, A takes B6, takes, D takes, right? Dropping the pawn, knight E4, bishop E3, and you can see the position takes on a different flavor. Yes, black has an isolated D pawn and isolated B pawn, but white has his weaknesses too, as you can see on C3 and A3. And again, you don't have the same problem where this bishop on C8 is locked out of the game. Look at the bishop now and compare it to how it was in the actual game. So that's a possibility. If you want to play, you're willing to accept the isolated pawn, is play this move E5 right away. if that's too risky, instead of playing knight c6, castle, and e5, a more conservative approach would just be b6 right away, just addressing it immediately. b6, addressing his bind idea immediately. So b6 again, a3 captures, and now knight c6, c takes, and you got this pressure on the d pawn, of course. Bishop e3, and notice with the knight and the queen pressuring d4, the tactic doesn't exist where you just take with the knight and then bishop takes h7 and all that stuff like that, right? So bishop e3, of course, black just ignores that pawn on b2. No need to get greedy in the opening. Bishop a6, again, you see the resolution of the bishop problem on c8. And to me, I'm old school. I go with, Capablanca, position over material, right? I need to have a good position and worry about the material later. So I'm not going to try to take the pawn on b2 with my queen. So after bishop a6, for example, knight a4, queen c7, did black lose the piece? No. This comes back, check. Say b4, queen takes a6. And this is a good position for black because the position of the queen on a diagonal prevents white from castling. So white's going to have to make a decision probably to go into the endgame. And this makes it a lot easier for black. Even though white still has this 2-1 majority, that alone is not going to be, enough to win the game. That's just a good thing to have. But you need more than that to be able to win. And black has targets on the d4 pawn, the isolated pawn to boot. All right. Say knight c5, for example, queen b5. And notice how I have highlighted the b4 pawn because, again, you fix those targets, right? Now the a pawn can't advance as easily. White has to try to prepare that, protect the b pawn. And while white is doing that, black can be building up attack on the b pawn. Play can continue. Queen d3. Takes. Knight e4. Rook c1. Rook fc8. And again, this is just a sample of how things could go. So those are my recommendations. Some of my recommendations to improve on Ivanchuk's play there. So like I said, instead of knight c6 right away, I would go for b6. That's my style. Again, another option, I didn't even show this option, is just e5 right away. Because you can see once the pawn is captured on e5, then the c pawn becomes weak. So play there, and this is for the more enterprising player. But play there will continue. D takes e5, knight g4. And now you're attacking both the e pawn and the pawn on c5. Let's say h3. See, knight takes. Say castle, and now bishop takes c5. Knight takes d5, and of course not queen takes d5 because bishop takes h7. So just simply bishop e6. Again, not getting greedy in the opening. And the game is going to be just pretty much equal, and you have this symmetry. So it looks weird at first to play e5, but once the fireworks are done, you can see that the position is pretty much equal. So e5 is definitely an option there. And if you can improve on black's play or white's play in some of my variations, let me know. I'm not saying this is the end all be all. These are just ideas that I'm sharing with you about the game. So my improvements, just real quick. Again, b6 is one. On move number 8, the other one is e5. Move number 8. And after the main line that was played in the game, after knight c6 and castle, my third improvement is e5 after knight c6. So basically, the improvement entails e5, but just at two different points in b6. All right, so there's e5 before knight c6 is played, and e5 after knight c6 is played, and then b6. So if you don't mind playing with an isolated pawn and playing a little more dynamically, then that's definitely something that you can try. But if you want, you can continue to try to work on this main variation, queen f6, and try to improve upon Ivanchuk's play here if you enjoy these type of lines here. So maybe going to the end game would have been better here. Queen takes d4. But it's definitely a long trek uphill. So anyway, I'll end it right there. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, get in the comments, let me know what you think. I'm gonna definitely be doing some more games from the Olympiad, and also check the box below for the links, and I'll see you guys on the next video.